Cloud. Okay. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining. I am going to, I'm going to have to multitask because I'm going to be letting a few people in. Um, so here is what I don't know if I can accomplish all of this in 1 hour, but that was at least in theory what I was going to try to do. Um, I would like to spend about 5 or 10 minutes doing an introduction. Um, I would like to spend about 15 minutes describing the encounter program. And then in theory, I would like to spend about a half an hour um, giving you, introducing you to some of the people I met, and then leaving about 5 minutes for some questions. Um, so that is my plan. We'll see how it goes. Um, In terms of introduction, I just want to say a few things. Number one, um, I just want to name that I am doing this presentation and feeling very anxious at the moment. I'm feeling very anxious for my Aunt Debbie, who has lives in Herzliya and has been going in and out of bomb shelters for the past um, 10 days or so, in and out of her mamad, is what they call the secure room. I am worried about my many friends who I have who have been going in and out of bomb shelters, who live both in Jerusalem and who live in the Tel Aviv area. I'm worried about many friends who I don't think I have many friends in the Israeli Air Force, but I do have many friends um, who are serving, who have served in Gaza and who are serving right now. May very well be in Lebanon. Um, and I'm feeling anxious about the state of the world, which is very much in flux. And both here in the United States and in Israel, in terms of the stability of our democracies, in terms of the stability of the Middle East. And I just want to sort of name a couple of things. There is a very, very good article that I will share out, but if you put into your search engines Shalom Hartman Institute Sources Journal, and you look, the most recent journal has an article called Communities of Care by the North American president Yehuda Kurtzer, and he basically talks about how important it is for us to build communities that are centered around caring for each other. And I just want to say, I'm not saying this to for pity, but it has felt a bit lonely. Um, I both within the congregation and also among my interfaith clergy. I don't think many people are reaching out to check in with me, maybe reaching out to check in with fellow Jewish community members. Thanks, Lori, for putting that in the chat. Fellow Jewish community members about how we are feeling and how our loved ones are doing. Um, Jennifer and I, 2 weekends ago, um, went to Virginia Tech and visited Ranone, and quite miraculously, the Friday night dinner was the theme was changed at the last minute, and the night before the war started, we ended up meeting with the Iranian Students Association, and it was an extraordinary experience. I had dinner across the table with a woman who did her high school and undergraduate work in Tehran, at the National University of Tehran. And we have been texting back and forth with those students. They are where they are politically, they're totally against the regime, and did a presentation that night about how many tens of thousands of people were murdered by the regime in January. We've been texting with them just to say we're thinking about you. We know that your relatives and we hope that they're okay. And I just want to encourage us to do that, whatever our opinions are about the war and about American politics and all the polarization. Um, and I want that, to me, this is a very difficult subject to lead around in our community. And my hope is that we can, I hope that my leadership can be one that really centers taking care of each other and listening to each other, which is really what the theme of my trip was. Um, the second thing, the last thing I just want to say is that there's a lot lost over Zoom. There's a lot lost over Zoom. There's a lot lost over, I appreciate those of you who can have your cameras on just in terms of seeing your faces. But ideally, these sorts of conversations happen with one another in person. And I just want to encourage all of us to be face to face with one another as much as we can. One last thing, which I want to say by way of introduction before I share some materials about the Encounter program. One of my teachers, Tal Becker, quoted this midrash in his in a recent article that he wrote, and it's a midrash about the Akedah, about the binding of Isaac. And the midrash actually says, Ratzah Avraham lishchot et bano, which is like even more than you get in the Bible, that Abraham wanted to kill his son, right? He wanted to do God's will and fulfill this, and he wanted to kill his son. And according to the Midrash, the angels in heaven start to cry, and their tears drip into Isaac's eyes. And that's why the next thing we learn about Isaac, essentially, is that his eyes were dim. And what Tal says about this midrash is that Abraham's inability to see his own son is what caused Isaac's inability to see later in his life. And that he sort of understands this as a metaphor for the Middle East. It's probably a metaphor for American politics and for the culture of polarization that we're living in, that when we are unable to see somebody else, when we don't feel like we are being seen, it makes it much more difficult for us to be able to see other people. And a main theme that really came up over and over again about the work of Encounter is helping people to see. So I want to share my screen now and share with you a little bit of the source book that we were given. I went on this trip in the middle of February. I think it was the 9th to the 13th or something like that, 8th to the 12th, and was part of a cohort of 24 conservative rabbis from around North America. And we did a program called Encounter. Encounter, I'll just read some of this, equips Jewish leaders to reckon with the firsthand realities of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a conflict with far-reaching consequences for Israel's security, Jewish flourishing worldwide, and the lives of Palestinians under Israeli sovereignty. They've been doing this work for more than 2 decades. They pivoted in, I want to say, 2019 or 2020, where they used to only bring American leaders to see, to listen to Palestinian voices. They now are focusing on bringing Israeli leaders to meet Palestinians, because they realized how little Israelis and Palestinians actually meet one another. And then they've also pivoted their work where when American rabbis such as our group come, they're sitting not only with Palestinians, but also with a variety of Israeli voices, which I think is a very important. Um, I think it's a very important pivot. And they are aiming, as it says here, since October 7th, rabbis have faced unprecedented polarization around Israel, Zion, and Jewish identity in their own communities. I would just like to say, yes, that's that that has been my experience. And rabbis need something more transformative, immersive training that cultivates deep listening, empathetic leadership, and practical tools for action. And so let me just review. Actually, before going through the program, I just want to review some of Encounter's values. Um, and not only did we learn Encounter's values, but at the end, I'll come back. We were really asked to think about and spend time writing and sharpening our understanding of our own values vis-a-vis this educational work. Encounter's values begin with Ahavat Yisrael, a love of Israel, a love of the Jewish people, um, and a commitment to kavod adam, to human dignity, the intrinsic dignity of every human being. Arevut, the fates of Israelis and Palestinians, like the fates of all Jews, are intertwined. And these bonds must guide our relationships with those with whom we are destined to share the land. Anava, humility, um, that you have to just be humble as we encounter all of this. Courage, courageous leadership. They're interested in supporting Jewish leaders who exercise bold agency in their communities, even in the face of risk. Hatmadah, steadfastness and perseverance. And these are not one-off things. And even though, as it says, quote in Pirkei Avot, we may not complete this work, we are not free to desist from it either. And achrayut, responsibility, the pursuit of that which is within our control, shifting away from blame and towards asking, towards responsibility and asking what is it that we're able to do as individuals and as communities. The arc of the program that we went on, if you look at the bottom here, we explored three areas of inquiry. Number one, sovereignty. What does sovereignty mean to Jewish Israelis in 2026? How do different Jewish Israelis understand, value, and seek to protect the state's founding ideals amid the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian reality? And how do we grapple with the gap between those ideals and present conditions? Number two, sovereignty and statelessness. What Jewish sovereignty looks like from the vantage point of Palestinians living under Israeli military and administrative authority without citizenship, which is the experience of Palestinians living in Gaza and the experience of most Palestinians living in the West Bank, and also East Jerusalem to a certain extent. And responsibility and relationship. What does Jewish sovereignty mean for the Jewish people? We asked that question in terms of people who are citizens, people who are residents, and people who are stakeholders. And the stakeholders, most of the people on this call are not citizens or residents of Israel, but we are stakeholders in what happens there. I will continue to contend that Jewish identity, not only in America, but around the world, is deeply impacted and deeply influenced by what happens in Israel and in Palestine in the Middle East. So we spent, you go ahead. Go ahead. We spent, I got there, I flew on Sunday, got there Monday morning, hit the ground running, spent all day Monday and through the middle of the day on Tuesday, meeting with Israelis, hearing about their experiences since October 7th, and how they think about these issues. We spent middle of the day Tuesday, all day Wednesday, a little bit of Thursday as well, reckoning with what are responsibilities of sovereignty as they're exercised over a people who are stateless. And then on Thursday, really trying to not wrap it all up in a bow, but to think about how to what this means for my own work as a rabbi in the context of our community and the context of the American community. So that is a little bit about the program that we did. In a moment, I'm going to turn to, hold on for 1 second. That's okay. Can you bring this stuff into the living room or dining room? Is that okay? Okay, all right. I got a hungry boy here. So I'm gonna introduce you to, I spent a while putting together this PowerPoint presentation introducing you to some of the people who I met. And in doing so, I've only shared, I'm working within the constraints of the program, and the some of the people with who did this dialogue with us were comfortable with us sharing their names and sort of having it be publicly known that they were doing this dialogue, and others did not feel safe or did not feel safe, comfortable with us doing that. And so I've tried to respect all of those boundaries in my presentation. So let me share my screen again. Let's see if I can do this. So do you all see, and maybe I don't, let's see. Can you all see this pretty well? Reflections on Encounter Trip. Amy Rips has given me an A-OK. Do I need to make it full? Maybe I can do this. That's a little bigger. Okay. So this is, you can see me way there in the back. That was the last day of our trip. We took a quick photo. We stayed at the Dan Panorama. And now I'm just going to give you the tour. When we first got there, we left from the Dan Panorama and went, just by the way, like walked over to the museum or the Center for North African Jewry in Jerusalem, which I just want to say I'd never been to before. Jerusalem is like this constantly unfolding place. And this was just a view from the back. One of the people who we met was part of, one of the Israelis who we met was part of Smol Emuni, which means the faithful left. And it's an organization of religious Jews who don't want to be associated with the current government. They actually formed before October 7th ever took place out of concerns with the way that the government, religious Zionism, was representing Judaism in this current government. They may have actually existed before then, but I know that's when they started to do their most serious work. This woman, the woman who we met with, said that she spent most of her time after October 7th. She sort of shifted from the work fighting against the judicial reform to mobilizing and essentially just helping with Shivas, and spoke about the experience, the months after October 7th, going to dozens and dozens of Shivas, and the organization really needed to rally. And sometimes what I've done, instead of, I'm just going to give you quotations that caught my ear. She said, after October 7th, I became much softer with people I don't agree with, more humble. Everybody here is part of the story. We all have to live here. And in this case, she was talking about fellow Israelis. There was a lot of stridency before October 7th, and Israel was able to achieve a certain détente, certain level of unity after October 7th. And while she continues to have deep disagreements, she also just was very humbled by the experience of attending all those Shivas. I've put together a composite I put here moderate scholar. We met with a few different scholars, and I put them together. One of the people was asked, or that each of the people were asked, what is at stake for how do you think about what's at stake for with Israel in terms of sovereignty right now? Um, and this person who describes himself as moderate, and probably even more so before October 7th, said that after October 7th, he really believes that what is at stake is the potential annihilation and ethnic cleansing of, and this was very interesting. He said the ejection of Israelis or Palestinians from the land. Um, he fears that Israel may, has dabbled in desires to expel Palestinians, and he also said, and this is I think an experience that many Israelis had on October 7th, and have more clearly now looking backward, that if Iran had sent ballistic missiles on October 7th or 8th or 9th, and if Hezbollah, it has been found out that Hezbollah had plans to invade Israel with a ground invasion through tunnels, and that if all of that, if they had joined in with Hamas, which is what Hamas's hopes, there really is a sense that the state of Israel might have fallen, and that tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jews may have been slaughtered, much more than October 7th. And one of the scholars actually described in a moment I still haven't forgotten. He said that on that day, he actually went through the process of making a plan to kill his children in case Hamas showed up at his door, because he said, I essentially could not bear to see my children taken captive or tortured. And this is, again, somebody who's works for peace, and is not somebody I know to be hysterical. When asked, what is our responsibility to Palestinians, what this person or amalgamation of person said is that, essentially he does not believe that most Israelis think that the occupation can end immediately. It cannot. There's a firm belief that a Palestinian state has to be demilitarized, and that in the meantime, there's a commitment to mitigating harm and violation of Palestinian rights, and that we have a duty to change the situation. And then, he just sort of put in there, we're failing, right? It's like, I am under no, I think that right now we in Israel are absolutely failing to do in our responsibility to Palestinians. One of the other scholars sort of spoke about the divide, a growing divide between American Jewry and Israel, and he put it this way: that the concern is that after October 7th, Israelis have become allergic to the idea of putting constraints on power. That somehow, if you question too much what the army is doing, that you're, saying, that you're not enough against October 7th. He just said he doesn't think that that's really happening within the army, but that culturally, it's become much more difficult to have conversations about the importance of maintaining constraints on power. Whereas American Jews, our experience is that constraints on power, on state power, are desperately important for the continuation of our survival. And that sorry, I just have to let somebody in, and that that gap in the communities is going to grow. I'll go on from this in a second. This scholar also said, there's no sin in laying out an aspiration that cannot be realized. There is great sin in laying out no aspiration or vision whatsoever. And I think that was a critique of Netanyahu, a critique of the current political leadership, that there's been continued lack of laying out a vision for the future. There was a longtime peace activist, somebody who's these were a couple of different people, another amalgam activist, somebody who's involved in J Street in Israel. This peace activist was on the phone with Vivian Singer. For those of you who don't know, she was one of the sort of mothers of the peace movement in Israel. He was on the phone with her on October 7th, and Hamas murderers entered her home and burned her alive on that day. And he was reflecting what I understand to be a real reckoning within the Israeli left about the possibilities of moving forward. And there was this quotation. He said, "We will still pursue peace. We will always pursue peace. But now I do so with a pistol that Ben Gvir gave me in the back of my pants," which is, an image. He certainly was not gloating or happy about that when he said it. He spoke about how his son was serving in Gaza, and his son said to him, came back from Gaza at some point and was sort of decompressing and debriefing and said, "Abba, we were 18 soldiers, and where we were stationed, we were in a Palestinian apartment." And his son said to him, there was a child's bedroom with pink bedspreads, and there were weapons that were being stored there. And the reality of the extent to which all of Gaza was militarized, and civilians, was very real. And he said this scenario, we ran out of coffee. We were using our own supplies, and we ran out of coffee. Should we have taken some from the kitchen, right? Or maybe some did, and they were. And what he said is, "I'm proud, and it gives me hope that my son asked that question, that he was burdened by that question." And this peace activist said, while my son was in Gaza, I couldn't see. And I'm going to go back to that theme of not being able to see. And he said, I couldn't see because my son I could not see suffering in Gaza. There was very different coverage of what was happening in Gaza, in Israel than outside of Israel. And he said, I believe in human rights, but I'm also with my son. He said, I'm with the people of Bondi Beach. And he said, I didn't turn to the right. What I did is I went deep into, I think what he meant is deep into my Israeli identity. And he talked about how his kids went to 7, 8, 10 different funerals during the period after October 7th, and the impact that had on him. We met a couple of religious women. One we met was from Efrat, which is a large settlement between Bethlehem and Hebron, which is south of Jerusalem. And she moved there out of conviction that God promised us, that specific land. And she said something very interesting. She had done Encounter before, and she said, quote, she would leave immediately for a permanent peace agreement. And she would bake a cake and leave it on the counter, right, for whoever ended up living in her house. And she said, but I will not do another Gush Katif. And for those of you who don't know the reference, Gush Katif is Gaza. And it was the uprooting of settlements from Gaza. And this is, within the Israeli perspective, that essentially uprooting the settlements and leaving was, within this part of Israeli society a disastrous mistake, because it eventually led to October 7th. There was a different religious woman who did encounter in October of 2025, and and her experience, she met Palestinians and listened, and she emerged from it actually rather despairing. She said, the ones who we met are the moderate ones, and she felt, that her experience was that they were not able to see, and she basically was saying, that we're narcissists, right? We Israelis are narcissists because we think that what we do will influence what happens, but the Palestinians mean it when they say from the river to the sea. And she was essentially in a place of wanting to wash her hands of responsibility for the Palestinians. She was actually born in 1993 and grew up with the Second Intifada and the series of suicide bombings. And then she told this very interesting story where, this is somebody who's quite hardened, and yet at some point there was an azaka, there was a siren from a rocket overhead, and there was a Palestinian gardener who I guess was nearby, and she felt, on the one hand, does not feel a sense of security around Palestinians, but also there was a siren going on overhead, and she said, "Come into my house," and welcomed him in. And I wrote here humility and judgment because I was just sort of thinking to myself, you know, uh, um, from 7,000 miles away, I don't face the challenge uh, of inviting the Palestinian gardener into my home while living under rocket fire, and just sort of what a tremendously different reality it is that she lives in. I'm going to do one more. I think I just a couple more Israelis. Then I want to get to the Palestinians as well. We met with somebody who's quite a prominent religious Zionist rabbi, who spoke very, about the importance of doing the encounter program, which he had done before. He had this quotation. He said, "It's the first time someone invited me to open my eyes and see what was happening beyond his own community." Spoke about how weakness makes you a stronger human being, and I think what he meant by that is that allowing yourself to be moved, and be pained and feel compassion for what is happening to Palestinians doesn't make you weaker, it makes you a stronger person. He told a story of being, because of his work with Encounter, being invited to Rahat. Those who don't know, Rahat is a Bedouin Arab village in the south that was actually affected by the Hamas invasion on October 7th. And this community was very supportive of Israel's efforts in the war, and they actually built a Hamal, which stands for Cheder Milchama, sort of a supply post for soldiers on the way to Gaza. And they invited him as a rabbi to come and visit, and invited him to say a prayer. And he didn't quite know what to say, and he's part of his prayer was, please God help my kids to remove evil forces from the world. And the woman at the Hamal said to him, if God hears you, my mother is going to be killed, because her mother lived in Gaza. And it was this humanizing moment, right, for realizing that, that he, and what he did for many months, he took a picture of his Shabbos candles, and each Shabbos before lighting candles, he would send that to her and tell her, "I'm praying for your mother's safety." He did this for about 6 months, and they would correspond. After 6 months, he stopped hearing from her, and a year later, he heard that person's mother had been killed by an Israeli strike in Gaza. Um, and you know, he also said, I sort of pushed him on the costs of his theology and the settlement movement. And he said, I recognize that, that we are failing. And, but we are part of what we're here to do is to do this better. And he said, just because we are failing doesn't mean you give up on the dream. And um, there's something about that that rubbed me the wrong way that I'm not gonna go into too much more. Um, and I think this is the last one in terms of the Israelis. We met a peace activist who is working within the Israeli political system to try to preserve the a Palestinian state for the future. And one of the things he talked about is about how Zionism is progressive, that within the Israeli Declaration of Independence, there it is built in the human dignity for Palestinians and for others. And he also said progressivism should be Zionist, that there's a fundamental justice in the Zionist project of the Jewish people, like every other people in the world, have a natural right to a homeland and to self-determination. Um, and he's trying to hold on to both of those. He says, because I am a Zionist, it's a mistake for our future not to think about the fact that Palestinians are living here. We need, that is part of his Zionism, is caring about what's happening with the occupation and what's happening to Palestinians. And he said, Israel and Zionism needs three borders. A we need a border separating the rights of the majority and the rights of minorities. And what he's talking about is we need a constitution that's based on the Declaration of Independence that prevents the judicial reforms and sort of the what that would have done to protecting the rights of minorities within Israel. We need a boundary between church and state, between synagogue and state, and he said we need a political boundary with Palestinians. All right, we had a wonderful experience with and we had a performance at the conservative movement's Fuchsberg Center, listening to the Jerusalem Youth Chorus. For those of you who don't know what it is, hold on for 1 second. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to share my screen again. And let's see, hold on for 1 second, actually. Yep, I'm going to share my screen again. And I'm going to put it on with sound. And I'm just going to play a little concert for you for a moment because we got to hear this when might drag you down. If you get lost, you can always be found. Just know you're not alone. 'Cause I'm gonna make this place your home. Okay, I could listen to that all night, but it's worth Googling. The Jerusalem Youth Chorus appeared on America's Got Talent, and we got to have hear them have a performance. We heard from both some of the Jewish teenagers and some of the Arab teenagers. Really, really amazing to hear from them. And then, I'm going to continue. Let's see, wait, share. Yeah. And, one of the leaders talked about how one of the Palestinians talked about how he was for doing this sort of work, he was attacked by sort of the BDS and the, quote unquote, pro-Palestinian, protest movements. And that his mom feared for his life because he was continuing to do this sort of coexistence work. And I think um, it's inspiring to hear something like the Jerusalem Youth Chorus, and also um, you know I have tremendous respect because people who are doing that sort of work pay a price within within their own communities, and then also pay this strange price. Another theme that came up a lot from many of the Palestinians we heard with is the sort of the more extremism that you find in the diaspora than you do in Israel and within Palestinian communities, uh, in Palestine. Um, all right, let me introduce you to some of the Palestinians who we met. We went to a place called Shorashim. We brought Shorashim here and by the way, they're willing to come back if somebody wants to underwrite another visit. Um, we brought them to Durham in January of 2024, and this is a group that does coexistence work between settlers and Palestinians in the West Bank. If you look at this little circle over here, you can see where it's located, but it was essentially south of Bethlehem and north of Hebron. One, the woman who we met is amazing. Um, she's a religious Palestinian Muslim who fights for women's rights within Islam, and spoke about the challenges of being called a traitor for talking with Israelis and being called a violent terrorist by others because she hates Bibi. And she talked about how for her she sees Islam being corrupted, that it's been hijacked, that sometime in the 1980s there were started to be declarations that Christians are kufar. Kufar sort of means um, uh, uh, rebellion, rebels, or sort of against the truth. Um, she had some very interesting. She said, that the hijab, for example, is not part of Islam, right? She said, she said it's sort of this foreign import, and she said there's no reason within Sharia law that a woman cannot be an imam, and she wants to become. I think she would be the first imam in the world. Uh, but just this deeply religious person, very committed to the work of peace. She said, "If you want to fight injustice, you have to be here and not demonize me on a keyboard." She had found, in social media and in other places, lots of people from outside villainizing her for the work that she wants to do. Um, she described, she said jihad, which is a term that is used for radical violence. She said is, within her understanding of true Islam, that is fighting the demons within one's heart. I was reminded of sort of the dangerous way in which the fight against Amalek, in how in modern Israel that gets taken to mean real people, whereas in the Hasidic understanding, it is that fight against the Yetzer Hara. And again, she has this vision that real Islam is 14 years old, and she actually goes far back as 1,200 years ago. Whenever political Islam begins, she says that's where it started to be corrupted. And she had this beautiful quotation that religion is a place where we can heal together. And I would just say, if you can't think about solving this conflict by trying to secularize everything. It's just not the way that the world in the Middle East works. Khaled Abu Awad was comfortable with me sharing his name and his photo. Um, he's the co-founder of Roots. I want to share his story. His mother was the leader of the first Intifada in 1987. And he was like amazing. He quoted again another religious Muslim who was quoting the Quran and a passage that extols the difference of the virtues of living in different communities. And then he started to do something amazing. He quoted he started to tell the midrash. Those of you who know the midrash around Sukkot, that you need all four types of Jews together to make a lulav, right? And he was saying we need lots of different types of people in the land of Israel. And I was just I thought it was amazing that he was able to sort of quote Jewish tradition. And later on, he even sort of talked about how I recognize that, the Jewish story, and he talked about how Jacob, God promises the land to Abraham, and Jacob and his sons end up in Egypt, and they come back, and then they come back to the land, and they look forward to dwelling in the land of Israel. There was something deeply moving for me about meeting a Palestinian and hearing that Palestinian sort of quote back to me my own story. And I think about the importance of being able to acknowledge different people's narratives, different people's understandings of their own story. Not because it's going to solve everything immediately, but it again, that I come back to that importance of feeling seen and understood. Um, he spoke about being raised with a real hatred of Israel. Israeli soldiers had shot his brother. I think that was in the early 90s. And he had a mourning tent. In Islam, the mourning period is for 3 days. And a couple of months later, there was a group of Israelis who reached out and said that they wanted to come. And he was asked, will you receive them? And his first answer was no. And somebody said to him, these Israelis are coming to you in peace. Like, we know them, and they want to offer their condolences. And within Palestinian society or whatever rules basically said, you're not allowed to say no if somebody's coming to you and wants to greet you in peace. And they sat together, and he said it was very destabilizing because as they sat together, he saw some of them cried at hearing the story of his brother, and he talked about feeling confused because if the Jews, the only Jews he had ever met were Israeli soldiers, and he thought that they all wanted to kill Palestinians, and he said they should be happy that my brother was killed if they're my enemy, but they're not. And that represented for him a shift in being able to see things differently. And again, he said, in terms of October 7th, I acknowledged that Israel had a right to react in the first few days or weeks or months. And his sense, as is many Israelis' sense as well, is that Israel went overboard. And again, there was something very meaningful hearing that acknowledgement of of an Israeli right to self-defense, and it made it I think more possible for to hear that critique, just in terms of how we listen to each other. We heard another Palestinian who sort of insisted very much on anonymity. Um, he sort of admitted to us that he actually, I don't think he's supposed to be working for the UN or supposed to, but he does work for the UN. His only job is to document Israeli human rights violations, and he sort of freely admitted to us that the UN has nobody that documents any sort of anti-Jewish violence in the territories whatsoever. Um, and he spoke about, and here I want to just focus on something for a moment. I'll read the last thing. He said, I've seen essentially the Palestinian Authority. It maintains its hold in the West Bank through brutal measures in terms of dealing with Hamas or the Palestinian Liberation Front or Islamic Jihad. but he always spoke with us about something very painful that which is and I heard this many times about what are called the hilltop youth, Naorei Givaot, um, and these, what he described is these 15, 16-year olds who are they've essentially become shepherds. They're not really shepherds, but they're using the fact that they are shepherds to push and 50 different Palestinian communities from their farmland, from their grazing land, and this has become a much bigger problem. Not to say it didn't exist before, but it's become a huge problem in the last year to 2 years. In some ways, using the cover of the war in Gaza, where that has depleted the number of Israeli soldiers in the West Bank, and using the permission and in some cases encouragement of extremists within the current Israeli government, and Netanyahu is politically captured by them and refuses to do anything. If you want to listen to an important episode of For Heaven's Sake, Lori, I bet you can find it. It was with Daniel Hartman and Yossi Klein Halevi, and it's called the Crisis of Sovereignty, and it speaks about how the rule of law has essentially been abandoned by this government, both with the Hilltop Youth and also with a terrible crisis of murders taking place in the Israeli Arab community, and then also in the Haredi community. So he spoke with us about that. On the third day, we went to a Greek Orthodox monastery. Most of the Palestinians who we met from the West Bank could not get visas to enter Israel, and it was not viewed as safe for us to meet in an Area A city. Area A cities are ones that are totally under the control of the Palestinian Authority. It was a beautiful monastery, and we could travel to this. Uh, I can tell you this person's name is Father Jack, and he's a Palestinian Catholic priest who lives in the only remaining Christian village in the West Bank. What's happened to Palestinian Christians is a story in and of itself. Um, he runs an excellent school, and the local Muslims will send their children to his village for education. Um, I think the more secular Muslims also come to his village for wine and beer and arak. And then there are also local kibbutzim that with which he has very good relations. He also spoke about the Hilltop Youth, who block the people of his village from harvesting their olive trees, have destroyed their tractors, have broken people's arms, and desecrated their church. And he is an extraordinary faith leader who says, "My enemy is the policy; it's not human beings, and my weapon is my faith." And sort of, graciously blames. He says, "Our leaders don't want us to be together," but continues to believe in the possibilities of being together. We met another young man who's a Palestinian. He's a social scientist. He lived abroad in London and several other places, and he now sort of runs in Ramallah. He does social science work, sort of polling Palestinian society, and sort of and it was interesting. He said he had avoided, while in diaspora, had avoided using the word apartheid to describe the situation in the West Bank. He said, but after 5 months in Ramallah, he really can't find another word to describe the reality of the West Bank, because the West Bank has separate roads for Jews and Palestinians, and differential treatment, and there's a difference in legal status. Um, he I Anyways, he talked in terms of his polling. He said the younger generation of Palestinians in the West Bank are more progressive and pragmatic than their parents. And he had some polls that said two-thirds of them want either a civil or democratic state, or a secular state, as opposed to a religious state under Sharia law. Um, he spoke about a prevalent narrative among Palestinians is that October 7th started as attacks on military bases. And then what he said is, those videos, it ended up, these fighters ended up at a music festival and they needed to kill lots of people in order to survive because they were surrounded by lots of people. He recognizes the falseness of that narrative, but sort of said this is one of the ways that October 7th is described in. It's not the only way, but one of the narratives within Palestinian society. That was more difficult to hear, just in terms of feeling seen and understood. He said that more than 50% of Palestinians in the West Bank are unemployed, 85% unemployment in Gaza, and that the average job is about 3,000 shekels, or about $1,000 a month. And he said, one of the quotations, I don't have hard feelings for Israeli citizens, they're just people, but talked about the policies. And he also echoed this idea that people in diaspora are more irrational and more extreme, than the people who are living there. Um, and maybe I'll just explain. You get a sense that Palestinians who live in the West Bank, at least, are not sort of don't have this fantasy that Israel doesn't have a right to exist, because it exists, right? And it's not. They're not sort of engaging a lot of the narratives that happen uh, in in the diaspora. We met an amazing. We went to the American Colony Hotel. This is one of Eric and Carol Meyer's favorite hotels. It's in East Jerusalem, and we met this amazing woman who's a teacher, and she was actually from Nazareth, and she came to Jerusalem and was described being on the light rail, and was like, "Wow, Israelis and Palestinians are like riding the light rail together." And then she like looked more closely and saw that, like, oh, they're like coexisting, but they literally don't speak to one another. Um, and she actually from there decided to teach Arabic in a Jewish school. And she told this amazing story. This was all in Hebrew, but I think I got most of it. She talked about having a student who was in her Arabic class, and one day, essentially called her a terrorist and said, get out of our school. And rather than sort of reacting, you know, this way, she took a deep breath and talked with the child, and found out that that child's brother had been stabbed by an Arab on a train a couple of days before. And she sat down and had hard conversations about how that makes her sad, and that not all Arabs are that way. And she did this amazing difficult work of teaching in a Jewish school. And she said, if I realized if I wanted to make a change, that I need to pay a price. I need to do this difficult work. She talked about teaching Israeli women Arabic, and Arab women Hebrew, and setting up these things where they could teach, learn from each other. And the problem that the Arab women didn't want to go to the homes of the Jewish women, because uh, these are my grandparents' houses, right? Because some of the people in East Jerusalem were expelled from West Jerusalem, and then the Jewish women were afraid to go into an Arab village, and she needed to arrange a bus in order to bring them to the Arab village, and she was very frustrated with poor government services, and ended up being the first Palestinian to qualify for the Jerusalem municipal government. And she ran this campaign. And in running for the Jerusalem City Council, she had the Palestinian Authority who was condemning her, saying your list is your candidate list is mixed with the blood of Gazan children, and she had the other religious sheikhs saying that you're a traitor. To vote for coexistence is to strengthen the occupation. And she was sort of saying to all of these people, I want better services for our children. And in order for that to happen, there needs to be representation on the municipal council. For those of you who don't know, East, Palestinians in East Jerusalem do not have citizenship, but they can vote in municipal Jerusalem elections. But there's never been somebody who is Muslim who was on the council, and she is actually the first person to do that, and just an extraordinary person. We went to the to the education bookshop in East Jerusalem. This is a famous bookshop, unfortunately infamous. Last year during my sabbatical in February, it was raided by the current Israeli government. The owner, who we met, Mahmoud Muna, who's a public figure, he and his nephew were both arrested, and then they were released because there was no crime. He spoke about, he said, I don't know who I am, right? I have, you know, he said, there are Palestinians, or what Palestinian identity is. He said there are Palestinians who live inside Israel. Israel has Arab Israelis, 1 million Palestinian who are citizens. There are people in East Jerusalem who don't have citizenship, but they do have residency in Jerusalem and can vote in those elections and can travel more freely, around Israel. There are Palestinians in the West Bank. There are Palestinians in Gaza, and there are Palestinians in the Palestinian diaspora. Many of them have different ID cards. It was important and to hear him describe October 7th as being heinous and unacceptable, and he also said, I understand Zionism as a component of Judaism, right? And he said, when asked about sort of, terms like occupation and apartheid and ethnic cleansing and genocide, he said, I don't need to use those terms. I'm not interested in sort of the social media, whatever, but we do need to find words for what happened, right? And I think that, that's a very important, that to me is a very important perspective that, I do think that things can be terrible and not be a genocide. And so I appreciated his thoughtfulness in that way. He also said, again, it's cheap to be radical in the diaspora, but and he's been harassed for doing this sort of coexistence work. And he said we, meaning the Palestinians, should be obsessed with the future, meaning we should be obsessed with 2048. We should be thinking about what do we want 2048 to look like, not being obsessed with 1948. And he talked about the importance of teaching past mistakes. It was a very jam. And then the last night we went to this place called Field Bait Cafe, which is located on what's called the Seam Line. Those are, basically where East and West Jerusalem, there used to be a border. Now it's where the light rail runs. And it's a joint venture between Israelis and Palestinians. And we heard from the founders and saw a show there. It was kind of modern performance art that I didn't really connect to, but anyways, it was a good experience to go. There was this beautiful sign on one of the buildings in Jerusalem. It says Ahavat Chinam, which means instead of Sinat Chinam, which is baseless hatred, this means baseless love. And I want to just finish by sharing a few final thoughts and then take some questions. I think we'll go to 8:15. First of all, I just put here open, closed, open, because I think before uh, October 7th, there was, from the people who we met with, there was an openness to dialogue and listening that very much closed in almost every case after October 7th, and that is beginning to open again. I don't say that with condemnation or what I think it's very natural. One of the things that we spoke about is trying to cultivate what somebody called a resilient Zionism, which is to say that Israel is a flawed place. There are problems, and we can stay in relationship with it. I want to say in spite of and maybe because of those problems that Israel is in need of us. And as I said before, part of what I was doing is also thinking about my own values when it comes to Israel education and sort of this, the work of this relationship. For me, it begins with a love of Israel, and I sort of have that with intentional ambiguity. A love of Israel meaning I think that we have a an obligation to care for our fellow Jews wherever they are in the world, for and the state of Israel, not because I love, I don't want to mix politics and religion, but the state of Israel is a mechanism, first of all, that protects half of the Jewish people in the world, and also is is the you've heard me say before is the most important project of the Jewish people in 2,000 years. I don't want to fall in love with it as part of a messianic dream, and I think that's dangerous. But I do still think that a love of Israel, of the Jewish people, and a dedication to this communal work should be part of our life as American Jews. Um, I want to cultivate people's deep knowledge. I think that, I think that we need to be reading a lot. We need to learn Hebrew so that we're having firsthand experiences. We need to learn about Israeli culture. We need to visit and have lots of different experiences. I want to say just explicitly that some people, if people would be interested in putting together a trip where we are going to do something like this, where the trip itself will focus. I don't think that this is the only way to visit Israel, right? There are lots of great ways to visit Israel, but one of the ways can be, okay, we're gonna go deep on trying to understand the many different perspectives of the conflict. I think that's important. Um, I also think we should do I'll come back to the last to this one last. I think that we should cultivate humility. We do not live under rocket fire. We do not live under occupation. We don't bear all of these terrible, terrible choices, and we should be humble about that rather than judgmental. We should have as much compassion as we can in our human heart. And I put here supportive engagement because I think we should be asking ourselves, how can we engage with what is happening in Israel um, in ways that are building the sort of future that we hope for and that we want. I went. One of the people I met with was Noah Bierman, and that's Nathan and Rachel's daughter, and she's doing excruciating work, essentially standing between the Hilltop Youth and Palestinians. And I and I said to her, and I do believe, I'm proud of her for as a Jew doing that sort of work because it's really important. In my estimation, what is happening with the Hilltop Youth is a disgrace. It's awful. Um, there are there are many different ways. I'll just tell you ahead of time. I just heard today we may be partnering with Med Delhi and to do a fundraiser to support a project that David Hassan, who's a local Palestinian neurosurgeon, and he's trying to build a children's village in Gaza, safe from Hamas. And we may try to support that. The Jerusalem Youth Chorus, and then there are, again, there are Masorti communities and there are Jews in the north and who are displaced from their homes, and we should strive to be supportive of the type of Israel and the type of uh, two states for the Palestinians and for Israelis that we want to see there. And I worry at efforts to disengage. And I also worry at efforts to sort of limit the type of engagement to one particular flavor of things. So I feel blessed to have gone on the trip. I didn't come back with lots of answers. I met lots of interesting people and heard lots of interesting things. And let me, I did all of that in 1 hour and 13 minutes. Maybe it was like 1 hour and 11 minutes. But if people want to either put a question in the chat or come off of mute and ask a question, why don't I offer to do that for a couple more minutes before we finish up?
Rabbi,
Yes, Amy.
so just a tangential question. I'm is Encounter the group? Do you know that Rabbi Eric Solomon wanted to go with years ago when he got serious threats to his family because of it from Jews? Do you remember?
So I don't think Encounter, to my knowledge, Encounter actually doesn't do like synagogue programs.
Okay.
Um, there is a tour company called Mejdi that essentially is it's basically the Palestinian tour company that will like take you, can take you into the Palestinian tour territories and set up things like this. And I believe that this is years ago, but I believe that what happened is that they sent a sample itinerary that included a visit to Arafat's grave, and then that was very, very upsetting to people. Um, so, but Encounter, I don't think they are, as an organization. Again, they started focused on working on like American rabbinical students. They've pivoted to most of their work now is actually doing work with Israelis, because again, most Israelis can go years without ever meeting a Palestinian. They will meet Arab Israelis in hospitals and pharmacies, or as waiters, and other things in Tel Aviv. There's some mixing of society there, but in terms of Palestinians in the West Bank, there's just not there's very little contact. And since October 7th, we should know that the permits, and here I'll just say I think with very good reason, many of the permits that were issued were exploited by Hamas to perpetrate the atrocities of October 7th. So I think there are legitimate security concerns, but there are very few work permits that allow people to come and work in Israel now, and so there's just tremendous lack of seeing each other. So most of their work is focusing on Israelis now, and then they're doing some leadership work, which is what how this program came about. Any other quick questions? Mike?
Hi, Rabbi. Thank you for sharing that with us. It was inspiring to think that there are still people that can talk with each other. And I find the situation personally really depressing. And somehow you always convey a sense of something better can happen, but the numbers just don't seem to match. And I find it hard to be uplifted by this. The stories are wonderful, and they're probably small in number, but I'm left with what I see is the political reality, and I think the facts over the past several years. And always reflect on my first time going to the West Bank, my first and last time going to the West Bank and seeing the three-road system. And I think that three-road system was apartheid at that time. It's probably even much worse now. So it's it's just hard to understand how one can see things progressing in this. That the numbers just seem like they're too small.
So I'll say a couple of things. Number one, I'm going to push back a little bit that, again, I actually think it does a disservice to apartheid, to use that sort of language. There are inequities, and Palestinians live under occupation, and I think those things are true. But whatever, we can leave aside the terminology. And I think the numbers, I get what you're saying. Some of what this young social scientist was saying, was a bit heartening. I think that, nobody looks back. We did not, of course, we didn't meet with those people, but we also didn't meet people who were saying, we think October 7th was a great idea. And, those aren't the people you're doing peace work with. But at least his numbers, seem to say that's, most people look at the violence and the extremism of October 7th as a failure, and don't want that for the future. And, again, I share your pessimism. I think the thing I'll venture two things. Number one, one of our teachers, said, he told the following story. He said, Adam, um, in the Bible, Adam is alone, right? And God says, I'm gonna find you, Ezer Kenegdo, right? Which basically means like um, someone who helps you, but also like pushes you, right? Kenegdo, like up against you, right? And then God brings all the animals, and nobody's right. And then when Eve comes along, he says, Zot hapa'am. She, basically says she's perfect, right? And what our teacher pointed out is that actually she's not. she she's not perfect. She's as a connecto, right? She's somebody who pushes you, right? And that Adam, he's making this mistake because he thinks that Eve is the solution to all of his problems. And what this teacher is saying is that, we should veer away from solution oriented thinking, right? That, like, is there going to be a solution, someday? And we should be much more practical in our approaches, um, and allow ourselves. I think the other piece of it is allow ourselves to be surprised. Again, a year ago, maybe it was 11 months, 11 and a half months ago at this time, I was in Abu Dhabi wearing a kippah. If you had asked me 10 or 20 years ago, was I going to be in Abu Dhabi wearing a kippah, going to an Abrahamic Families Initiatives with a church and a mosque and a synagogue, people would have said you're crazy. And it came about. How that's going to happen in Israel and the West Bank and Gaza, I don't know, right? But I also need to be humble, and that doesn't mean I'm just gonna say nothing I do matters, but I'll pray. Like, I want to take responsibility for it, and I also want to allow myself to be surprised, at the way things may unfold. Pearl, you're special. Do you have any question whatsoever? Because you're amazing. But you're on mute. I don't know if you got to press that here. I can even ask you to unmute. Yeah, there's Beth. She can help you.
Oh, I didn't know you were still
Yeah.
here. No, I'm just happy to hear this discussion. It's very satisfying to
Okay.
to not hear a purely one-sided talk.
Well, I appreciate that, and I appreciate you. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm going to stop our recording, and